Now joined by Richard Morley, who's the deputy leader of the Rejoin EU party and a great sparring partner on this show. Richard, welcome to the show. Always a pleasure. You've got to be delighted. Let's be honest, Richard, that we've got a Labour regime in power. They wasted no time in Washington at the NATO summit, cozying up to Brussels. And now, week two, they're on the Eurostar, straight back into the belly of the beast.
Well, of course, I'm very pleased that Labour has seen the light, you could say. Yes, they seem to be on the path towards closer relationships with Europe, and I think that is a very positive thing. It's also what the British people, by what we see in the polls, wish. We can't, of course, rejoin the EU in a single stage, but he is doing the obvious thing and beginning to stage the preliminary steps towards a greater integration with Europe than we've had under the Conservative government.
Now, you've hit on a key point there. We probably won't get a second referendum. Not even the Labour Party surely would be crazy enough to risk that, or at least put us through another referendum again. But what we're seeing instead, Richard Morley, is something more sinister. It's death by 1,000 treaties. It's political declarations so beloved of Brussels. David Lammy wants declarations on things like energy deals, on climate change, illegal immigration. And of course, everybody knows, Richard, Michel Barnier, your best pal, has said all along, we cannot cherry pick. If we want these piecemeal deals, that will come at a price. And the price will be freedom of movement. Is that what you want, Richard Morley?
Well, you talk about it as if it's a price that we have to pay. I think freedom of movement is a liberation that we receive as a benefit of these closer negotiations. And I know that many, many English people want to be able to travel and work and return to the freedoms they once had in Europe. This is a very, very popular move. And it's not only important for people freedom, but the freedom of movement of goods is equally on the cards and also very important, because I know the British businesses, particularly small businesses, are suffering from the red tape of the bureaucracy and the extra costs that Brexit has put upon them to sell their wares to our closest neighbours. And that is something which has done real harm to the British economy and many small businesses across the country. And that is what the Labour government wants to attend to, and I'm sure they will.
Well, Richard, both imports and exports with the European Union have increased since Brexit.
Brexit introduced new barriers. It turned the highway into a bumpy road filled with hurdles. One of these hurdles was the reintroduction of trade barriers between the UK and the EU. These barriers dreadfully affected Britain's trade performance. According to the Office for Budget Responsibility, the UK's trade intensity, trade as a share of GDP, has dropped by 12% since 2019, which is 2.5 times more than any other G7 country. This decline indicates a significant reduction in how much the UK trades relative to its economic size.
There may have been a few minor niggles, but the net numbers in and out are both up. We're on Groundhog Day, aren't we, Richard Morley? Richard Morley, we are on Groundhog Day. Like, you still talk about freedom of movement being a net benefit to British people. You mean people who have second homes in Europe, people who want to go and travel, a tiny minority of the privileged few, whereas millions of low-paid individuals came into Britain and took jobs from the working classes. We're at the same position in this conversation we were in 2016.
Well, first of all, on this point about imports and exports, I dare say that your facts are correct on the total numbers involved, but I was talking about small businesses. And small businesses involve a great deal more people than the large corporations and big businesses are that are doubtless benefiting in some ways from Brexit. And small businesses is a very big concern for my party. We represent small, ordinary people wanting to survive. On the question of, what was the other point you raised, sorry?
It was quite a simple point, and that is millions of low-paid workers came in and took the working class's jobs, and that's why they voted en masse for Brexit.
Yes, of course. Now, the point is that freedom of movement is most desired by young people who are used to going abroad and studying or living there for short periods, 2 or 3 years, and they want to be able to have that freedom to do this again, not necessarily to settle in Europe, but to get the experience and the work benefits which they would get from being in Europe for a few years. And that freedom has been taken away from them. And that is precisely the area in which I know that the Labour Minister and the EU are going to be discussing this afternoon. It was on that particular point which was relevant to their discussions.
Okay, can I interject? We've got 20 seconds. Do you think Labour wants to get us back into the EU?
I think Labour wants to have a policy of common sense, and it's common sense for us to have closer ties with the EU for the preparation of eventual reintegration when the time is right.
And I think, Richard Morley, I think that's the most honest word you said in this conversation, the eventual rejoining. You're always a pleasure to have on the show, Richard Morley.
Vote Rejoin EU. Join the EU vision.